we'll go ahead and get started and people can jump in. We're excited to be presenting this case study to everyone today for a project we did with a finance group that walked them through developing a functional strategy as well as implementing it. So just so everyone's aware, this is being recorded, so we'll be able to send the video out to you and the slides. If you have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand, put it in chat. We'll definitely get to it. You don't have to wait until the end. But thank you for joining us this morning/evening, depending where you are. And I will turn things over to our trusted managing principal, Mark LaScola.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Well, gosh, I don't know what to say actually. Let us get right to the webinar. Threw me off there, Reagan. I thought you were going to Dan. So Dan, how about you, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then I'll do the same for me.
Yeah, happy to do that. Hi everybody. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Reagan. Just a note of process. We'll take questions along the way, so we'll make sure that we receive your questions and address them as best we can. My name is Dan Schmitz. I'm a consultant, an organization design consultant here at On the Mark. My early career was in industry, as we tend to say, with the Clorox company, and I was in various functional roles to include capability development. I have a bit of education. The one that I'm probably most proud of is a master's degree in organization development from Pepperdine. And I have some experience at this point with organization redesign, functional design, M&A integration, strategy development, strategy implementation, and of course, the latter two items are what we're here to talk about today. So I'm happy to be with you all. Mark?
And I'm Mark LaScola. I'm Dan's colleague as well as Reagan's and other On the Mark team members on the call. I founded the business 32 years ago, and I'm delighted to be here. And so let's get on with it, Dan. Let me say a couple words about On the Mark. A funny thing is, if you'll notice here in our solution sets, we really don't talk about our work in strategy development and strategy activation, but is very much part of our solution sets, particularly as part of business integration, M&A work, and organization design. We go deep into strategy, but if you can follow my logic, is we did not want to compete directly with McKinsey in terms of strategy development, strategy activation, and recognize that the larger firms has much bigger resources and sometimes in terms of strategy work. So strategy development for us and activation is a common part of our solution sets. For those of you first time on this call, just to give you some sense of the depth and breadth of our experience, that we've done over 450 redesigns or operating model modernizations, well over 900 projects in our 30-something years for just about every type of industry, NGO, government organizations, both national and multinational types. We also do quite a bit of training and development using the 10-20-70 model in our organization design, for our organization design solutions. So we're delighted with our track record, but as some of you know, and many of you know, you're only as good as what you have in front of you. So one of the most important things to On the Mark is help our clients be successful, and we'll continue to be here tomorrow. And so we started on that back in 1990, and we'll continue to apply that in our work. And so this is really excited about, actually. I'm excited. Dan put together this case study. Some of you know we probably do 2 or 3 case studies a year on projects that are different or have different features to them to showcase our work. This one is no different. Is really proud of the work we did. Dan, Irina, Thomas During, who no longer is with us, but is still with us on the planet, but not with On the Mark. I think Dallin actually even on this call before he left to join another firm, supported us in this work. So Dallin, kudos to you. Dan, thank you for all this great work that you did, and of course to our customer. So let's move forward. The focus of the webinar, when at the end, Reagan will and Aaron will let you know how to get a hold of our case study. But we really want you to understand what was the business context and the drivers of why the client said we need a new functional strategy. What were their desired outcomes? We also want to take the time to talk about what is a robust functional strategy, and a functional strategy is very different than an enterprise-wide strategy. We can talk to that or in practicality. I think some of the places you're going to get the most wisdom is from the plan, or what we talk about is when how is as important, if not more important than what. There's a lot of wisdom in the way we set up the project, and we'll share with you some of the milestones and some of the learnings. And we'll talk about some of those results from both the strategy development part of the project and then the strategy activation. So we have results from both of those parts of the project. And then Dan and I will, I'm sure we've got lots of wisdoms to share with you, as well as scars that we'll share. And that's really how we're going to go about our time together. Again, I can't emphasize enough, please ask questions along the way. Reagan, just a logistical thing, can we unmute people to ask verbal questions, or is that just not part of the feature on Zoom webinars?
No, we can unmute people, so we can go ahead and do that. And then feel free also, if you don't have a moment in, to type it in the chat and we'll address it, but we can unmute people.
Let's do both if you don't mind. Keep it close to home like that. All right, Dan, I'm in your hands. Or I was going to I was going to take this one first. And let me go through this real quickly. Dan and I are going to bring to life some of these wisdoms, but I want to show them to you up front so you can look for them as we go through this. And Dan, how about we just ping pong on these? I'll take the first one and you take the second, and so on.
That sounds good.
I want to talk about, I hear a lot of people talk about strategic planning, and one of the things that really helps your strategic planning work, or any strategy or any operational planning, is having the right planning schema. I'm going to show you what a functional strategy is from our perspective and how we approach that. But it's one of the things that whenever you go in to an organization and they say, we want strategic planning, one of the immediate things that you need to be thinking about is, do you have a schema and a framework that connects strategy to making it real? And if you don't, does the customer have that? And we'll point that out here. It's one of the, I think, one of the wisdoms in making this work successful.
And I think one of the foundational elements of this project's success is found in, well, all of these items, but number two is what I consider a bit special. This was a strategy development process that I would characterize as by the people in the organization and for the people in the organization. And the collaborative process followed a general pattern of divergence and convergence. And we'll have an image that'll make this really clear in the next slide or two. The divergence was an opportunity to reach out beyond the strategy development team and pull data and pull points of view from across an organization that has a reasonably global footprint. But then once we gather that data, and I should even change that pronoun, because OTM wasn't directly gathering the data. We were helping the organization gather the data for itself. But once we have that data, then we need to pull it together and make sense of it and fold it into the strategy development process. And then we would repeat that. So the pattern of diverge, gathering data, converging, integrating that data, and then repeating is really a critical success factor. And I think one of the elements that made this project really special.
Yeah, and when we talk about data, we're not just talking about facts and figures and best practices. We're also talking about human data, anecdotal, people's experience. So using a type of collaborative methodology that allows that to happen is critical. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan and the importance of having the right plan to fit the right situation is key. We're going to share with you our plan of attack, and hopefully you'll get some value from that.
Item number 4, we can't do this alone. And we had a very strong executive leadership and operational leadership, and we had regular touch base meetings with them to not only assess how the plan was being executed, but feedback that they would be able to provide from the organization itself. And the message here is that this is a partnership between project leadership, executive leadership, and on the mark. And without that type of partnership established up front and continued throughout the duration, the success, I'm sure, would not have been as great as it was.
Yeah, and what needs to be said about making a strategy real, keeping it alive and relevant is really critical. The last thing we want to be known for is a strategy on a wall, and it's a pretty picture, but never is brought to life. And the executive team was very clear of the importance of bringing it to life and making it real and day to day, almost like a set of guardrails, which the entire global function could work by.
And that point number 6 is pretty important. The leadership was not at all aligned to the idea of some big splashy strategy rollout event. Well, there was the November event, so I have to rescind that comment in part. But beyond that, when we were activating the strategy, it really needed to be woven into business as usual activity. And that was a critical parameter that turned out to be a constraint that really worked quite nicely for us.
So let's move forward and let's talk about this. Dan, would you like to cover this?
Sure. The broader context for this functional strategy was a new enterprise strategy, and that was rolled out. We might refer to it as the 2030 enterprise strategy. But when that was rolled out, the functional leaders reflected on, okay, what is the implication of that strategy for our function? And now we have a North Star, which is the enterprise strategy. What do we need to do functionally in order to enable its success? And what was going on inside the organization is there were significant technology projects. There was a realization that if the function continued to work as it had, which up to this point had been successful, it's going to be bypassed by those organizations that are more substantively leveraging technology and how it can facilitate and in some cases do the work. The strategy itself at the functional level had not been updated and maybe even talked about in several years. So I'm forgetting the exact number, but it could have been 8-9 years since that strategy had been developed. And in many organizations, strategies are rolled out and people become aware of them, but then they stop being a focus of conversation, and then people's awareness diminishes, especially when new people come into the organization. If they're not grounded and onboarded in strategy, how could they possibly know? Internal customers were demanding more from finance. So when we talk about a function, we're talking about finance, and any function has its own set of customers. And in this case, these customers were the business, and the need for talent to develop. So we're not only talking about implementing technology solutions, but the skills that the finance function globally is a function itself, inside or outside this organization, is shifting. So there's less there's less need for some of the real basic operational activities that finance and accounting have been doing up to this point. When the organization looks out into the future, they see a need for a different type of skill set, and they want to ensure that they're not only developing that talent from within, but also hiring for that talent as well. So the objectives, they want this strategy to be relevant. They want it to have day-to-day utility. They want it to integrate the team into something more cohesive than a bunch of individuals doing work that don't really understand how they relate to one another. And they were looking for something pragmatic that would help them transform from the way they had been executing functional activity to the way they knew they needed to be executing that activity in the future.
This global finance had a global footprint: Australia, Japan, the Pacific Rim, the US, Europe. And so we're talking a very real global footprint here. Rachel's asking a question, Dan. Well, let me go back before Rachel. Dallin asked a question: were the strategic objectives something the client had already arrived to, or were they supported in outlining the objectives in what the objectives should be? You want to take that, or do you remember that planning meeting we had on site?
Yeah, I certainly do. Dallin, the way I'll answer this is we had a planning team with leadership from the function, and it knew this person representing the function knew what they wanted to accomplish, but it doesn't mean that they arrived at our planning meeting with it fully articulated.
That's right.
So I would say that what we helped them do is pull out and articulate the objectives that had already been in conversation within the function. They just hadn't been crystallized in a way that makes it easy to see and line up to and work toward.
And Rachel, let me answer this question. Rachel asked the question: what type of assessment was used to identify what was going on and what they wanted? Rachel, we don't have this here, but we have something called the OTM STAR model. It basically looks at an operating model and all the elements of a business and say, what are all the moving parts? The method that we used was just had people talk to what was going on. So the executive team, the design teams that we worked with, they were pretty straightforward and candid. And it really ended up being a constellation of indicators of or things that were going on. I'm gonna make the leap that some of you on this webinar might actually be a finance professional or working in a finance function or have worked partnered with a finance function. One of the interesting things that's going on in finance is the evolution of finance, as Dan said, from an accounting professionals to professionals that have modeling skills, AI skills, business analysis skills. And what's happening is there's almost a Venn diagram happening with finance and IT, where the skills are actually becoming overlapping, where an IT professional or someone with really good IT skills actually looks very promising for a finance job of the future. We had all that data available to us. So the way we gathered that information was just to work directly with the teams and ask them what was going on. They also had internal customer feedback, but in just a second, Rachel, when we get to the plan, I'm going to show you how we collected even more data that was even more rich than what I just articulated to you. So really good question. Dallin, let us know if we answered that for you, and we'll keep moving on.
Mark, before we move on, I just want to touch on that word assessment. And it's really, I think it's a good word. And I also think it has different connotations. So what I want to make sure that everyone is aware is we didn't go in and assess the organization, collect our own data, and then report back to the organization what we found and what we think is the right set of remedies. But so the assessment that we conducted was a different type of assessment. We led the organization through an assessment of itself, both inside the organization as well as outside the organization. And on the basis of that learning process, they took that data and then integrated it into their own functional strategy that they felt was right for them, not what we felt was right for them.
One of the things, Rachel, is very important, just by the way you asked the question, kind of reeks of doctor-patient or expert consultant model. We are anything but that. So everything that we do, what we don't want to do is become the beholders of information and then come down from the mountaintop and bestow the 10 commandments on the masses. But we can do that in ways where we provide them frameworks, tools, formats. We guide them through the work, but actually don't do the data gathering, don't do the interpretation. We guide them through that process.
And so the importance of this slide is just growing on me as we sit here and discuss some of its features. Last point that I'd like to share is in the lower right-hand corner. This is a quote that describes leadership's orientation to strategy development. They wanted to include a diverse group of people who represent and see the different finance sub-functions, the different cultures of a global footprint, different backgrounds, different generations. And so there was a very deliberate attempt, well, more than attempt, an intention and an execution to make sure that we were pulling for all of this into the conversations, into the assessments and integrations, to make sure that the atmosphere is open and free for everyone to make contributions. And this says something about the type of leadership that needed to be in place for this type of strategy work to unfold, because there's another paradigm that says we'll just get a group of leaders in a room and we'll set strategy and we'll deploy it into the organization. We'll push it into the organization with tactics that are commonly understood through change management.
All right, let's keep going, Dan. So these were our deliverables that we agreed, is that we would collaboratively develop a strategy, a functional strategy that reached out at least 3 to 5 years. Along the way, we would ensure strong stakeholder support all along the way, not just at the beginning or at the end. And there would be a comprehensive, robust implementation plan, which included activation. So those were some of the early things that we had agreed to deliver for the customer. Let's shift gears here, and maybe Dan, you want to start us down this road about what is a functional strategy, and these components, if you can do the math, is, I think it's let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 8 components of a functional strategy. Is a pretty standard functional strategy for us. Dan, you want to talk about a couple of these things?
Yes, I'll just thread my way all the way through them without spending too much time in any or the total slide. Everyone's familiar with the mission, with statements of mission and vision. Why do we exist, and what do we see ourselves looking like in the future? A very significant part of the conversation was the value emphasis. How are we going to create value for our internal customers, and what will that mean for the customer experience that internal business leaders need from finance, but also having identified them, how are we going to organize ourselves and skill ourselves up to make sure that we're capable of delivering that? Of course, that leads us over in the direction horizontally to capabilities. What do we need to be able to do to deliver the customer experience that will fulfill our vision and mission, right? And that also includes, how are we going to work together? We need to make declarations. Are we going to be internally collaborative and pulling on skills and experiences wherever we find them in order to deliver the customer value? Or are we going to work in silos and essentially isolate ourselves from one another? And all of this points to the direction of the skills of the future. We've talked about this earlier. Modeling talent, familiarity with technology, familiarity with the practical aspects of the business. All of this is skilling that we need to make sure that we're headed toward, because there's, of course, in any organization, a distribution of skills, and we need to identify what we will require and then start building toward it. And of course, that leads us to the enablers. How are we going to develop all of these capabilities? So collectively, we organized our functional strategy schema around these 8 items, and this is what we set off to develop.
Any questions regarding the components here that you're looking at, why 8 versus 9 or 10, or what does something mean? You can both voice your question or you can write it.
Can you give an example of future ways of working?
We can indeed. One of the, if you look at future ways of working, who asked that question? Is that you, Peggy?
It's Val.
Valerie. Good to see you, Valerie. Good to hear you. Future ways of working. If you look closer at that picture, Valerie, you might recognize it as a remnant of Galbraith's original STAR model. Future ways of working in that picture includes how do we set ourselves up, organize around the work, and what behaviorally do we have to do differently? One of the things, roles that they put in place to make the strategy come alive that they really needed to focus on was something called a finance business partner that leaned way farther in and actually did completely different work than a business partner did today in finance. And they only had a few of them in today's world. But in tomorrow's world, they wanted business partners very close to the internal customers, the different parts of the business, and the way and what they did with them were very different. For example, how do they provide to them insight and decision support, not just reports, which is a big deal. Does that make sense to you, Valerie?
Yeah, perfectly. You know, I just hear this term, the future of work and future ways of working, tossed around a lot lately. And
Indeed.
that's why I thought I would ask to, you know, kind of be clear about what you guys mean by it.
Well, it's really a good point. And Dan's gonna say something here. For us, the future of work is a mix up, a salad bowl, if you will, of generational expectations with, can we work differently, virtually, on site? Can we gig it? There's a whole bunch of stuff in this thing called future of work. And what we tried to do with them is saying, in the finance, in this global finance function, is how are you going to set up yourselves? How are you going to work together? That's required in the future, given those the future of work dynamics, generational differences, et cetera. So Dan, you were going to say something.
Yeah, yes, to add a bit of detail here. Some of these, I agree, Valerie, some of these words are really easy to throw around, and as a result, they are thrown around. What we did here was we declared, or the organization declared, what is it going to stand for in terms of ways of working. And some of the detail that's not on the slide here includes innovation. We're going to be an innovative finance function. And in many cases, finance functions are not deliberately innovative. In fact, they're just running the standard operations of the profession. But this organization made a declaration that it's going to do more than that. It declared that it was going to be internally collaborative, not only inside the function, but also with the business partners. So these are just some of the stakes in the ground, the lines in the sand, choose your metaphor, that says, this is what we are going to be. And because the whole community shared in the development of those declarations, everyone was already aligned. There was no selling. We didn't need to go out and convince people that these ways of working were going to be important. They decided that this is what they were going to be internally, and that's what they meant by future ways of working.
So there's two questions, Dan. One I'm going to let you think about, and I'll answer. So Susan Donnan asked about capabilities. What do we mean by that? And I'll answer that. But is it Shane? Or Sean? Appreciate the clarifications as we can get. It's important to get your name correct. But asks states the finance functional strategy cannot be developed in isolation from the organization's customer strategy, should have impact and influence. Did you do any assessments in relation to the rest of the organization, business and operations model? We'll come back to that as well, because I think there's a couple things that are important there. So Sean or Shane, can you just let us know how to best pronounce your name, whether verbally or typing it in would be helpful.
Mark, Sean's fine. Sean's my name.
Okay, thanks, Sean, for letting us know. So Susan, to your question about capabilities, a really good example is capabilities for us is not a skill of the future. It's not an individual skill. A capability that they needed in the new finance area was something that they called analysis and modeling and decision support. These are capabilities that need to be done, that an individual can bring skills to that, but by themselves, one individual having those skills does not make a capability. So capability basically says, if this is what we want to deliver to our customers, and these are the things that add value, what do we have to do really well across the business? So it's larger than any individual, and it really has to do with work that has to be done well to really differentiate themselves. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything you want to add to Susan's question about capability before going to Sean's comment.
I would call the capabilities bit organizational capabilities, and skills of the future being more individually oriented capabilities.
Right. What I would say about organizational assessment, this customer has been a customer of On the Mark since 2012, and we've probably done 30 different projects with them across the business, a number, probably 15 different redesigns. And so we had a really good idea about what was going on with the rest of the organization, and used the new strategy rollout for that, what Dan cited as the 2030 strategy, and everything we did connected to that 2030 strategy and the larger elements of the enterprise. We also had an HR business partner who was just fantastic and worked across as well with us. So it was an integrator with other things, not only HR, but across the business. So there were lots of integration points, both what we were doing and how we were doing it with the larger, broader strategy. Shall we move on, Dan?
Yes, please.
Great. All right. These are going to animate here. I guess I should have done that before. All right, so Dan, how about let's go over the plan. So this is, I'll set it up for you, Dan. The client engaged us in March, and we came to agreement in April, and flew out and met with them the first week of April. They gave us till November to develop that strategy. The rest of here is our plan. So Dan, how about taking the team through this?
Yes. It's pretty simple, really. On the basis of that plan, which is step 2 in green, we identified data that we wanted to collect, and we'll show that. I believe it's on the following slide what that data was. And each one of those collections was its own small project. We might discuss it as that. And then based on that information, which was then summarized and consolidated into 2 types of pre-reads for that June meeting in item number 4. One was a high-level summary, which was all we could really expect anyone to read coming into the June meeting, but there was also the full package of detailed learning. That June meeting was the first opportunity to take that information and start integrating it into what we might call the first fuzzy outlines of strategy, working in the context of the functional strategy schema that we just talked about. Once we started to, and I think we have some pictures to give you a sense of what that June meeting looked like, it produced an output that was then subject to review and approval by higher, the more complete functional leadership team, not all of whom were in that June meeting, but we wanted to make sure that we were covering off the stakeholders and we're moving forward with an aligned plan. We don't want to get too far down this path only to have somebody introduce a requirement or dissent that would substantially or create the opportunity to derail the work that had been done and where we're headed. So coming out of that step 5, we realized, or we understood, that there was more data that we needed to go out to collect. So we did that in step 6. And remember, there was an intention to include all voices, generations, geographic locations, functional subfunctions in the function, men, women, almost every type of demographic variable you can imagine. We integrated that in to make sure that we were reaching out in the organization. And we did the same work coming out of step 6, which is integrate that data into a summary and a complete detailed document. It's important for me to point out and remind us that the summary, the data collection and the data summaries, while OTM assisted, we didn't do the work, right? Because we don't want those summary decks to be something that OTM thinks about this function. We want to make sure that it comes across as this is what the function thinks about the function. So the process is really important. That fed the September integration meeting. We went through another process of review and approve. And then there was a fair bit of preparation and organization and orchestration and design that ultimately led us into the November conference, where we helped the global leadership team, which I think was about 120, 140 people, really take in a more substantive way the content of the strategy. They'd been hearing about it, they've been seeing some of the pieces, but the November conference was the opportunity for the strategy team to work with the more complete group and really make sure that everyone was understanding strategy in the same way. They understood the implications. They had an opportunity to talk with their peers about the content. And so the full plan from agreement to November conference looked like a general diverge-converge pattern that repeated itself with stakeholder work in between.
Thank you, Dan. A couple of things I want to highlight. You see milestone 3 and milestone 6. When we first did the plan, we said we're going to have task teams. We don't know how many they are. Those task teams are going to do research. They're going to do their own assessments. They're going to look into best practices. So they did all those things and way more. Actually, in round 1, we had 5 task teams. And in round 2, I think we also had 5 task teams, just so that you're aware. What we did with those task teams is we facilitated those meetings and walked with them all the way through. We set up their work plans. We provided them the templates and the tools, but they did all the legwork and they did all the interpretation. They were completely in charge of what the content was. And so all we did was ensure that everyone was working by the same sheet of music. Peggy, I'm gonna just put you on the spot here. Peggy says, Dan, she's amazed at how quickly we were able to move through. And you know, all of you, many of you might appreciate what July and August is like in Europe and other parts of the world outside of the US. It's a big vacation, holiday, PTO time. People are out of the office. So it was not to go from June working globally through September was a bit of a heavy lift. And of course, down under in Australia, vacation time is really right around Christmas, January, February, which fortunately we missed those months during the strategy development type or time period. There's a question, what type of data collection methods did the client select to gather data and how did they know their opinions? Why don't we go there, Dan, and let's go through this and maybe we can go into, this is a Gantt chart of looking at everything we did was color coded. For those of you who appreciate neuro-linguistic programming or NLP, you know the importance of shapes and colors and symbols. And we repeated that over and over again. This is the first set of task teams that we launched. The first team did an internal view of finance. And the whole point of that was, what is the relevance of the current functional strategy? And do people across the finance organization working within it have a clear line of sight to that current strategy? So it was an internal view of finance. Dan, you want to take the second one and I'll take the third?
Yes, happy to. Number one was fun, and that was one of the ones that I led. And a common response was, "What? We have a finance strategy, right?" So it's a bit of levity. We have to find fun in the data, right? The finance customer view. This is where we went out and identified and then had conversation with the internal customers of the finance products and services. And here's where we queried and put down on paper exactly who we were serving and what they needed out of this function in order to be successful with their businesses. Mark, do you want to take three?
Yeah, I do want to address Wilson's question. Wilson said, great plan, but the timeline seems really long. Can the timeline be shortened? It can be shortened, Wilson, but the degree of collaboration is going to take a toll on the capacity of people who are involved. We probably touched 75 to 100 people worldwide in this project, in the development of the strategy alone. Just being part of different task teams, being part of the discussions, being part of the work. I think we estimated the task teams, 25% of their time would be spent on the task teams, and task teams lasted about 4 to 6 weeks. So they had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. Yeah. So if you're going to compress the time frame, you've got to make more availability. Otherwise, you got to default to the expert consulting mode where an expert comes in and does it for you. And then you're going to lose stickiness and sustainability. So that's your trade-off. The third task team, digitalization, really looked at where does digitalization have to happen in finance, and where should we be taking advantage of digitalization? It wasn't just digitalization, it was also digitization. So where can we digitalize work that we do today that would make it simpler and more effective, more efficient, as well as digitalization? So that team looked at that. Dan, number 4.
I'll keep this one short. The people in the function, if given the opportunity to assess where they're good and where they aren't so good, in a safe environment to do so, are pretty forthcoming. And so this one was not that difficult. People understand where the strengths are and where the gaps are. And so this one went along pretty effortlessly. Mark, I do want to just comment very quickly here on the aspect of perception. Even here in the audience, Peggy is saying you moved through that timeline quickly, and Wilson is saying seems kind of long. So there is that matter of perception, and a lot of the success goes back to setting expectations with leadership and leaders leading. And if you ask the leaders about the timeline leading up to November, they would say that it was appropriate. They wanted involvement. They know involvement takes time, and they accepted the timeline and never really gave any indication that they were dissatisfied with the whole sequence of activities and its duration. So Mark, you want to take external view?
Yeah, this one is what does finance look from our from outside the company finance? What's going on the finance field? And they interviewed finance companies, finance consulting firms, other finance functions, and got some really good, rich data about where is finance heading. All of these groups also did best practices, had access to Gartner research, and made full use of that. So it was really, and each team created its own set of reports and had detailed data behind it. And so just to give you some sense, oops, wrong way, apologies. This is an example of just a snippet of the internal view. This is one page of their report, what their findings were, but it gives you a sense of the robustness of the work that they did. They had some work going around what they were calling 3 pillars in their global finance function, and they were, and that's what this means by the 3 link to the 3 pillars. Dan, I'm going to keep us moving if that's okay with you.
That's perfectly fine.
This is an example of the integration meeting. Dan, I can't recall where this one was done. The June meeting. It wasn't Australia. That was September. I recall that.
East Coast.
East Coast someplace. And if you look up on the wall there above my hand, you'll see that it's the same picture that you've seen around the project plan, and always using that as a "you are here" map.
You know, I'll admit that when we put that map together, it felt like an internal planning exercise, and I underappreciated how important it was to bring out and make sure that everyone clearly understood where we were along the timeline. And the fact that we had it printed out and we brought it into each one of the meetings was more helpful than I thought it would be. Let's put it that way.
All right, let's keep moving. The focus of task team round 2. Well, here was the focus, and I think the topics speak for themselves, but let's go over them. Skills of the future. Dan, did you work on that team?
No, but I can talk to it.
Okay.
So in a sense, we are starting to converge here. We've had our first data collection. We've had the first integration meeting. We've started to build out what I might call the fuzzy outlines of what the strategy is going to look like. And some elements are less fuzzy than others. So we knew where we were headed, and therefore we could launch a task team to really start drilling into what do we think the skills of the future are going to be based on the work that we've done thus far. And so the task team there was a task team launched to start making connections between where we think we're headed and how that's going to deconstruct into what do we need our people able to do and start articulating and aligning on that. I'll take innovation as well. Mark, it was the same type of conversation. The group broadly understood that it's going to, that being innovative was going to be required for future success. So there's a task team organized around what does being innovative mean in the context of a finance function. Mark, over to you.
If you're not picking it up, and I should have put in another slide here, is all of these task teams are working on one or multiple parts of the 8 elements of a functional strategy. So if that's not perfectly clear here, you'll see all of this folding in on each other. Is everything we're doing here is deliberate. So the future customer experience for the finance function, again, we talked about the customer experience in the functional strategy. Here it is, them talking with customers and saying, what do you need versus what do we deliver today? What has to be different? Again, lots of reaching out to customers in teams of 3 and doing what we call dialogue groups with customers. It was quite substantive and quite pithy in terms of how they collected that data. You know what, Dan, I should probably take the operating model refinement because it was the work that Thomas and Peter and I did with supporting Thomas in 2 days in, I think it was in Paris, with the team that of about 20 people. That piece of work was actually doing a roll the marble, what we call a roll the marble activity, identifying what are all the shortfalls of the current operating model, and identifying how the operating model going forward needs to be refined. And that's a good point out, Dan. Do you want to highlight that there? Your comment you just made about connecting to Sean's query earlier.
Right. So I'm thinking about what I might add here, other than recognizing that, Sean, you asked a question about making sure that the strategy as it's being developed is being developed in context with the operating model and how it was set up. So I don't really have a whole lot more to add here, other than this is the point where we get to answer your question, Sean, which is the integration with the operating model.
And the last thing we did here was started to draft the strategy. So all of these task teams pre-work and all of the integration workshops, we were drafting things, and they kept feeding up, which ultimately we're starting to complete all the 8 components. And of course, they were the groups involved were not the final approvers. You'll see a name in here. It says David's approval. David as the Chief Financial Officer for the organization, and the executive team had final approval. And so all of this work then rolled up. Last big milestone I want to talk about is the November conference, which was the 120, 150, I can't recall. I know it was in the 3-figure numbers, and it was a global conference. And this was our design. We did not have the entire conference. We had basically just a portion of the conference. And on your left is kind of our layout for day 1. And on the right is our real brief agenda for day 2, and all the different teams we had going on in real time in the conference to get their head around and for us to socialize and get feedback on the conference. It was 2 days, and I'm not sure what else I can add. Dan, do you want to add anything?
In a previous career, we used to talk about the dog and pony show, where leaders would get up and just talk about strategy and tell everyone what they thought that they needed to know about strategy. If you look through this agenda, you'll see very little of that. You'll see some words from the CFO. Those are limited to 10 minutes. What you'll see more of is small group dialogue being led, and this might not pop out of the plan here, but being led by members of the strategy development team. So it was, again, consistent with this is a strategy of the people, for the people, and being, people are making sense of it on their own terms and with groups of their peers.
Susan asked a really good question. Do I understand correctly that the 8 elements were developed in parallel? Some of them were, Susan. Some of them got more quicker leverage. So for example, in the first round of the task teams, some of those elements were drafted before, but ultimately they were all they all had to fit with each other. So for example, gosh, I hate to go back here because I don't know how to do it simply, Reagan, if you can imagine, Susan, the 8 elements in the first integration workshop that we did in June, coming out of the first round of the task teams, one of the things we did there was actually draft the value emphasis, what On the Mark calls the gravitational pull, or what they rechanged the name to value emphasis. We drafted that, but we didn't finalize that until September, October before the conference. So everything got drafted. Some things in parallel, some things got a little ahead of each other, but they all ended up being looked at the end in a holistic way. Does that seem to make sense to you, Susan?
I can hear her fingers typing.
Exactly. All right. This is just a picture of the conference. Some of the conference attendees. The On the Mark team is not in there because we're not part of their team, and rightly so. And there was a lot of work going on. You can see that, Dan, I think you created these beautiful pictures on the wall on a flip chart, which were the 8 elements of strategy, which was a lot of work by itself. We had teams working on that. All right. Let's talk about strategy activation. So when we finished the conference, that was November. We started the activation work by January, February at the latest, because remember, Australia was an important part of this global finance function. So Australia in January kind of shuts down a little bit. People go on holiday because it's their summertime, even though for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we might think about Christmas and getting back to work in January. So our attention turned to activating this strategy. Dan, do you want to talk about some of the objectives here and maybe in between the lines here about strategy activation and what we put together for them?
Yes, I don't want to read this slide. You can do that easily amongst yourselves. I think the big picture here is there was a lot of work done to develop strategy, a lot of engagement. Even after the November conference, the risk is that strategy just hangs out there. And when we ask ourselves what strategy really is, it's a collective agreement about how to make decisions and what we're going to invest our time and energy in doing. So the objectives of activation were to continue to build off of the November conference and drive awareness and understanding and behavior into lower levels of the organization, so that people started to behave in ways and make decisions in ways that were aligned with strategy, so that strategy comes off the page and into daily life. We called it bringing strategy to life.
So I'm going to go to this. What we put together was a plan of activating the strategy and making it very close to home in terms of teams working with this in their natural work teams. And what you have here in front of you is a lot of detail. And Dan really carried this piece of work. We did a planning workshop with the main executive sponsor and the implementation lead. And we basically mapped out for 6 months, well, more than 6 months, April through December of the following year, activation activities that would take each component of the strategy and make it real for every team across their global finance function. Dan, do you want to highlight one or two of these? I'll take one, but if you want to pick one after me, that'd be great. The first one that I want to talk to is something really simple, which is if you look at 13th of April, launch it on the 10th of April, was we put together an activation plan, which is basically an activity with protocols, templates, tools, what to do, questions to ask, that every leader in person would have in their team meeting, that basically introduces the finance strategy and links it to day-to-day work that the teams are doing. And every team had to add the strategy into their ongoing team meetings and connect the work that they're doing to the strategy. And we gave them examples and samples and et cetera. So this is what we mean by activation or activation activities to make the strategy come to life. Dan, maybe you want to pick one or two that you thought were...
Yeah, I'll point out, let's say two and discuss them together. The first item is row number 3, spotlight on David's podcast. The second item is number 5, IPM's part 1. So we were endeavoring to integrate the content of these activations with those other things that were occurring in their environment. So David's podcast was talking about strategy. So we launched an activation that focused on it and used it as material to further conversation about what was he talking about and what was its link to strategy. Item number, and what does that mean to me personally as I do my work on a day-to-day basis? And then item number 5, IPM's part 1 is linking in with an HR process. So as HR was running its process to set individual performance objectives and metrics for the coming fiscal year, we came in and dovetailed with that conversation to really put the skills that were requested in the strategy into that conversation, so they weren't seen as something separate. But when people were preparing to create their plans, their personal plans, they were also having the conversation about what was being asked of them from strategy. So the message here is the integration of the strategy activation and those other things that were going on in their work life.
And the one more that I'll use as an example is number 2, innovation part 1. We would start innovation or activation activities and do parts 1 and part 2. In fact, you'll see part 2 innovation down on line 6. Again, putting together protocols, some governance around this piece of work is we asked each team in the organization to start to look around and say, what work can they stop? That makes no sense. It doesn't add any value. But you can't just stop work if you don't have a clear line of sight of that work and the impact of that work upstream and downstream. So there was a process, a disciplined governance process that teams that identified work to stop had to go through and make sure that that work could be stopped without having any negative repercussions anywhere else across the finance organization. I'm sure you all can appreciate it, but that's this gives you a really good sample of the activation activities that Dan would design with the customer, get a focus on, and then develop the protocols, the guidance, the steps, the instructions, the tools, whatever was needed. And we would send that out to them 3 or 4 days before, and the week before, for them to use in the next launch in the next week. Dan, is there anything else you want to say about these activation plans? I'm sure you're reliving this experience as we talk about it.
Each one was more work to develop than it might look like on the page here. But working with a strong client lead, we would draft and edit and tailor. This plan was set out, say, before 13 April, but it would shift. So we held it lightly. And when something came into our awareness that created a good opportunity to integrate strategy implementation with those other things that are going on in work life, we would shift. And so it was a bit of a flexible plan, but with strong partnership, it worked really well.
Yeah, and you can see on this slide here, there's a metrics plan and activation below. We also collected metrics along the way to track the relevance of the strategy and the activation activities.
So a quick point on that, Mark, is some of those metrics sort of started to live, and others didn't. And
Right.
And once we get into the pragmatics and the organizational cost of measurement, the client said, okay, we're going to just focus on these metrics, and these other ones were good conversation at the time, but we're not feeling as much energy behind them today.
All right, I'm going to just come back to the keep us moving through this, Dan. But you get a sense of what activation looks like. Another good example, we would even set up activation activities where they just would discuss questions. And here's some example of those questions, and how they pointed towards different parts of the 8 components of a functional strategy. So let's talk about the results. The success was that they had a clear functional strategy, which provided direction and guardrails. It had a lot of substance to it. Of course, I'm sure you can appreciate we can't share that with you, the details of that. But the thing I really kind of want to focus on is here is 100% awareness of the strategy and the function, having a common sense of purpose, and an active strategy, and involved in everyday business conversation. Dan, maybe you want to highlight some things here, and I'm going to pull up some of the quotes here from some of the executive team members, but whatever you want to talk to around the results.
I think they were so brief and powerful. They more or less speak for themselves. But I would challenge anybody to look at those and say and ask themselves, would I not want these outcomes from a strategy deployment? And if there's something missing in there, then that's part of the conversation. But awareness, relevancy, part of the ongoing discussion of business, like that's what we were aiming for, and I think the feedback came back feeling even better than we would have hoped.
And going back to my original line, is you help your customers be successful and the rest takes care of itself, is exemplified in the bottom left quote there. So in closing is where I started, in terms of some of the big wisdoms for us. Are there any questions about these wisdoms, or what we did, or why we did it, or why this wisdom over others? And feel free to give voice to your question or comments.
I'll fill a bit of space here. It's all important. The one that really attracts my attention and energy is number 6, making sure that the activation is pragmatic and directed directly connected to what people do on a daily basis, making it real, making it relevant. That's the difference between strategy that we put on the back of our security access badges to remind us what we're supposed to be doing. So I'm really strongly attracted to number 6 amongst a set of very strong wisdoms.
Yeah, Chris asked a really good question. For point 5, he asks, how can the strategy be described today, 2 years on? It's a really good question, Chris. We should go back and ask them. But for whatever it's worth, another function, Chris, where one of the leaders from finance is now residing, has brought us in around some strategy work around another global function in that same company. But we haven't been back there for a while, back in that function. So it'd be interesting to see how they would describe it. And I think you raise a good point. Valerie writes, Dan, no question, but I love how you work through the strategy development process to come back to wisdom. Thank you. You know what, Valerie? We've been around the block a lot together, and it's lovely to hear your voice, and what you said there means a lot to us. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dan and Irina and Thomas. I know Dallin, who was on here, who's now with Slalom Consulting, but always an OTM family member. All of them worked very hard on this project, and even Reagan, actually. Reagan did some of the infographics. Do you remember Reagan on the project?
I do remember, and some of the animations for the implementation.
That's exactly correct. So anyway, it was really just an incredible team effort. Really team effort.
You guys, I wanted to add, you have some of the best slideware I've ever seen, like the greatest icons and the, most kind of powerful, I don't know, everything is just presented so well. And whoever's in charge of that, good job.
Well, we'll give that credit to Aaron Ball on the call and Reagan. So nice job, guys. Thank you for helping us. And thank you for that, Valerie. First time joining, Tracy says, it was very nicely done, shared in a great way. Thank you very much for that, Tracy. Any questions? Reagan, I'm going to pass it back to you to close it up. Maybe you want to highlight a few things before we close it up.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you everyone for joining. I feel like this was a really helpful conversation, even for myself. So I hope you all took something away from it. And we have a few other events coming up. So if you want to have more discussion with us, we'll be having an event on October 6th. So it's just next week, about the difference between organization redesign and organization restructure, and kind of how those terms are used differently and what we mean, and understanding, when you should use each. We also have a organization design solution that focuses on our methodology and how we operate on October 27th. And then early in the new year, we have a 5-week masterclass that focuses on organization design and how to modernize operating models collaboratively. So we'll send out these slides. You'll have the links. You can always email us if you have any other questions. And also, lastly, we do have the paper copy of this case study that we'll be sending out to participants. So we'll get those over to you, but really appreciate you joining and hope you all have a lovely rest of your day or evening.
Yeah, and Reagan, you'll take any feedback on the case study, right? If people want to talk about it more deeply, we've got hundreds of slides. We can, but anyway, is that okay, Reagan?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, email, respond to us once we send that over. If you have any questions or think of anything else, we're always happy to talk and connect with you.
Yeah, thank you, Saeed. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great sleep or good evening or good rest of your day wherever you're at in the world.